I live at the end of a heavily wooded, private cul-de-sac somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. The property is a sprawling, single-story, mid-century modern build with a full, unfinished basement. After a very drawn-out and exhausting divorce, I ended up keeping the house. Living alone in a space originally designed to hold a family of 5 does something strange to your perception. Over time, you become intimately familiar with the acoustic profile of the empty space around you. When a house is that quiet, it speaks to you in a language of settling wood and shifting temperatures. I learned to recognize the specific groan of the roof beams in the late afternoon sun, the sudden rush of water pressure in the copper pipes behind the drywall, and the low, familiar rumble of the furnace kicking on during the colder months. You map these sounds in your head. They become the normal background noise of your life. For almost a year of living alone, the house never made a sound that I couldn't immediately identify. That changed on a Tuesday night in late November. The temperature outside had plummeted below freezing, bringing a bitter, dry cold that seeped into the window panes. I was upstairs in the primary bedroom. It was around 11 o'clock. I was propped up in bed, reading a book on my tablet, just winding down for the night. The house was dead quiet. Then, I felt it before I actually heard it. It started as a dull, heavy thud that vibrated up through the floorboards and into the frame of the bed. It wasn't a sudden, sharp crash like something heavy falling off a shelf. It was a methodical, rhythmic impact. Thud. A pause. Thud. Another pause. Thud. My immediate thought was the HVAC system. The basement unit was old, and I figured a belt had snapped, or the main fan housing had come loose and was violently striking the metal casing. It was annoying, mostly. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, dreading the idea of having to call a repair technician out on a holiday weekend. I waited for the system's safety switch to trigger and shut the furnace down, but the heavy pounding just kept going. I reached over to my nightstand and opened the smart home app on my phone to check the thermostat. The screen illuminated my face in the dark room. The system was completely idle. The furnace wasn't running. In fact, it had cycled off over 20 minutes ago. That was the exact moment the annoyance evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, sinking weight in my chest. If the mechanical systems were dead, then the house should have been entirely silent. But the rhythmic striking continued, echoing faintly up through the central air returns. Someone, or something, was down there, actively causing that sound. I didn't panic. Panic gets you hurt. Instead, a heavy sense of clarity washed over me. I quietly slipped out of bed, leaving my phone on the mattress. I reached into the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out a heavy-duty Maglite flashlight. I deliberately kept the power off. Turning on a light would immediately broadcast my position to whoever was downstairs. My eyes were already adjusted to the dark, and I knew the layout of my own home better than anyone else ever could. I stepped out of the bedroom and into the hallway. I walked carefully, placing my bare feet on the extreme outer edges of the floorboards, right where they met the baseboards. That's where the wood is supported by the joists and is least likely to creak. The hallway felt incredibly long. With every step I took toward the center of the house, the physical nature of the sound became clearer. It was coming directly from the basement. And it wasn't just a heavy impact anymore. I could hear the distinct, harsh scrape of metal grinding against concrete. The basement is accessed through a heavy wooden door located in the mudroom, right off the kitchen. As I crept into the kitchen, the hardwood floors cold against my feet, the rhythmic pounding stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. I froze, pressing my back against the kitchen island, holding my breath. A few seconds later, the scraping sound resumed. I approached the basement door. I could feel a faint draft of cold air seeping out from under the threshold. I pressed the side of my face against the solid wood, listening intently. Below me, I heard the distinct sound of crumbling debris falling onto the concrete slab. I gripped the doorknob. It was an older, heavy brass handle. I turned it with agonizing slowness, applying upward pressure to keep the internal mechanism from clicking. I pulled the door open just a fraction of an inch, just enough to look down the wooden stairs. The basement was entirely dark, except for the far back corner. Someone had set up a high-powered industrial LED work light on the floor. The beam was blindingly bright, casting sharp, distorted shadows against the exposed brick and concrete foundation. Kneeling in the dirt and dust, directly in front of the foundational wall, was a man. The sight of him chilled me to the bone because he looked absolutely nothing like a burglar. He wasn't some desperate kid looking for a television or a laptop to pawn. He was dressed like a professional contractor. He wore dark, heavy-duty canvas work pants, steel-toed boots, and a gray hooded sweatshirt. Covering his face was a large dual-cartridge respirator mask and a pair of clear safety goggles. He was holding a heavy masonry chisel in one hand and a short-handled sledgehammer in the other. I watched through the crack in the door as he positioned the steel chisel against the mortar joint of the cinder block wall, pulled his arm back, and delivered a punishing blow with the hammer. He was systematically and efficiently tearing down a section of my home's foundation. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. He moved with the terrifying confidence of a man who believed he had all the time in the world. He was treating my house like a construction site. I didn't yell. I didn't announce that I had a weapon or that I was calling the cops. Confronting a physically fit man armed with a sledgehammer in a confined underground space is a death sentence. I slowly let the door ease shut, using the palm of my hand to guide the latch so it wouldn't make a sound. With my other hand, I reached up and carefully turned the heavy deadbolt, locking him down there. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. I grabbed my phone off the kitchen counter, turned the screen brightness all the way down, and dialed 911. I didn't speak. I used the emergency text feature. I typed my address, stated there was an intruder in the basement actively destroying the foundation, described his tools, and told the dispatcher I was hiding on the ground floor. The text came back immediately. Units were dispatched. Do not make a sound. The wait was pure agony. It felt like hours, though it was likely only 6 or 7 minutes. I crouched in the dark behind the kitchen island, clutching the heavy flashlight. Beneath me, the methodical destruction continued. Smash, scrape, the crumbling of concrete. He was entirely focused on whatever was hidden behind that wall. He had no idea I was sitting right above him. Finally, I saw the silent flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the trees outside my living room window. The police had cut their sirens a block away. I crawled over to the front door and silently unlocked it, opening it just enough to let the officers inside. 3 officers entered the house. They didn't speak. They moved with their firearms drawn, communicating entirely through sharp hand signals. I pointed toward the mudroom. I pointed at the deadbolt. One officer took a position on the stairs. Another grabbed the deadbolt. He threw the lock, kicked the door wide open, and shouted down into the dark. The commands were deafening. A sudden explosion of authoritative screaming designed to completely overwhelm whoever was down there. The hammering stopped instantly. I heard the clatter of heavy tools hitting the concrete floor. There was no struggle, no running, just the sound of handcuffs ratcheting tight. When the house was finally secured, a detective asked me to walk downstairs to identify the damage. The basement smelled heavily of pulverized concrete and old dust. The man had been taken out to a squad car, but his work light was still shining brightly on the back wall. He had successfully broken through a 3-foot section of the cinder block foundation. Behind the broken blocks wasn't solid earth. It was a hollow void, a hidden compartment built directly into the structure of the house. Sitting inside that dark cavity, covered in decades of dust, was a heavy, military-grade Pelican case secured with 2 heavy padlocks. I stood there staring at it, my mind entirely blank. I had lived in this house for years and had absolutely no idea that compartment existed. The detective later explained the situation to me. The intruder wasn't a local criminal. He was carrying a sophisticated signal jammer in his backpack designed to knock out cellular and Wi-Fi networks, though he hadn't turned it on yet. He also had a detailed, hand-drawn blueprint of my house, including notes on my vehicle and my work schedule. He had waited for what he thought was a night I would be out of town. He refused to speak to the police, refused a lawyer, and simply sat in his cell with a blank expression. He was a professional retrieval specialist. They eventually traced the origin of the hidden case. The man who owned the house before me, the one who sold it to my ex-wife and me, had been a senior logistics coordinator for a major aerospace defense contractor. He had died of a sudden heart attack 2 years before we bought the property. Whatever he had hidden inside that foundation was important enough that someone hired a professional to break into my home, tear down a wall, and take it back. The police confiscated the Pelican case. I never found out what was inside. I moved out of that house 3 months later. I couldn't sleep there anymore. The fear didn't come from the thought of ghosts or the bumps in the night. The fear came from the sudden, jarring realization of how fragile our sense of security really is. We lock our doors, set our alarms, and believe we are safe in our little boxes. But the terrifying truth is that if someone truly wants what is inside your house, and they have the skills and the backing to get it, your walls mean absolutely nothing to them. You are just an environmental hazard in their workspace. When I was 19 years old, my parents inherited a sprawling, partially renovated farmhouse situated on 40 acres of dense, rural woodland in upstate New York. It was the kind of property that sat miles away from the nearest paved county road, accessible only by a long, winding gravel driveway that disappeared entirely during heavy snowfall. In the middle of January, they had to travel overseas to settle the remainder of the estate, leaving me alone to act as the caretaker for 2 weeks. At that age, the isolation didn't feel like a vulnerability. It felt like absolute freedom. I had a fully stocked refrigerator, high-speed internet, and a massive house entirely to myself with zero supervision. The auditory landscape of a rural property in deep winter is usually completely sterile. The heavy accumulation of snow acts as a massive acoustic dampener, absorbing the ambient noise of the woods. You don't hear traffic. You rarely hear the wind, unless it's a severe storm. You just hear the heavy, suffocating silence of the cold. It was a Friday night, roughly a week into their trip. I had established a very unhealthy sleep schedule, routinely staying awake until 3 or 4 in the morning, playing online games in the main living room. The room featured a wall of large, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the dark expanse of the front pasture. Around midnight, the profound silence of the property was broken. The nearest neighbor lived over 2 miles away, separated by a thick line of timber, but they kept a pack of massive livestock guardian dogs to protect their sheep from local predators. I heard them through the thermal glass of the windows. It wasn't their usual territorial barking. It was a vicious, aggressive frenzy the kind of sustained, feral warning they only issue when something large and unwelcome is actively moving across the property line. I paused my game and muted the television, listening carefully in the dark. The barking continued for several minutes before abruptly cutting off, plunging the valley back into that heavy, oppressive silence. I walked over to the glass and peered out into the darkness. The security floods illuminating the gravel driveway were off, leaving the exterior completely black. I reasoned with myself. I convinced my anxious mind that it was just a wandering coyote or a stray deer triggering the dogs. I refused to let paranoia ruin my night. I returned to the couch, put my headset back on, and actively ignored the deep, primal instinct that was quietly warning me that something was wrong. An hour passed. The digital clock on the cable box read 1:15 in the morning. That was when I heard the physical interaction with the house. It wasn't a knock. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of boots compressing the frozen snow on the wraparound porch, followed by the subtle scrape of leather against the wooden floorboards. Someone was slowly walking the perimeter of the house. I sat completely frozen on the couch, the bright light of the television illuminating me perfectly for anyone looking through the glass. I realized with a sudden, sickening drop in my stomach that the blinds were wide open. I was essentially sitting in a brightly lit display case, while whoever was outside was completely shielded by the dark. I immediately dropped to the floor, crawling on my hands and knees toward the television stand to reach the power strip. I killed the power to the entire entertainment center, plunging the living room into absolute darkness. I lay flat against the hardwood floor, controlling my breathing, straining to track the movement outside. The footsteps moved methodically from the front porch, down the side steps, and toward the rear of the property. Then, I heard the heavy metallic rattle of the back door handle being aggressively tested. My immediate reaction was paralysis. The nearest sheriff's deputy was easily 30 minutes away, assuming the winter roads were even clear. I was unarmed, completely isolated, and whoever was outside was actively looking for an entry point. After an agonizing few minutes of silence, I convinced myself that the locked doors had deterred them. I assumed they had moved on, realizing the house was secured. I quietly crawled out of the living room and slowly made my way up the central staircase to the master bedroom on the second floor. I locked the heavy oak door behind me, crawled into bed fully clothed, and lay in the dark, clutching my cell phone. I must have drifted into a state of exhausted half-sleep because I was violently jolted awake just after 3 in the morning. The sound of a heavy diesel engine shattered the silence of the night. A vehicle had pulled directly up to the back of the house, idling rough and loud in the cold air. I heard a heavy vehicle door slam shut. A moment later, the structural integrity of the back entrance was compromised. It wasn't a cinematic kick or a sudden crash. It was the terrifying, splintering groan of the door frame giving way under the immense pressure of a heavy pry bar. I dialed the emergency services number immediately. I spoke in a desperate whisper, providing the dispatcher with my address and stating that an active break-in was occurring. She informed me that a patrol car was en route, but warned me about the significant distance and the road conditions. She told me to stay on the line and remain absolutely silent. Below me, the house was being systematically invaded. The intruder wasn't trying to be quiet. I could hear heavy boots stomping across the kitchen tile, followed by the sound of cabinets being ripped open and the violent crash of electronics being thrown to the floor. They were moving with incredible speed and complete disregard for the noise, operating under the assumption that the sprawling, dark farmhouse was entirely empty. I tracked their movement by the destruction. They moved from the kitchen into the dining room and then into my father's home office. I heard the distinct sound of heavy items being dragged across the floor and hauled out the back door. The diesel engine continued to idle outside. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the heavy footsteps recede. The back door slammed shut, the diesel engine revved, and the tires crunched heavily over the frozen snow as the vehicle pulled away down the long driveway. A wave of overwhelming relief washed over me. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for an hour. The dispatcher on the phone asked if they were gone. I whispered that I thought so, that I heard the truck leave. And then, the blood froze entirely in my veins. From the bottom of the central staircase, I heard the unmistakable creak of the floorboards. The truck had left, but the intruder had not. They had simply loaded the vehicle, sent it away with an accomplice, and returned inside to continue clearing the property. The realization was physically nauseating. They were taking their time. They felt so incredibly safe, so completely unchallenged in this remote location that they were willing to stay behind and strip the house bare. The heavy footsteps began to ascend the wooden stairs. They were slow, deliberate. The intruder was carrying something heavy, the metal scraping occasionally against the wooden banister. I retreated to the furthest corner of the master bedroom, pressing my back against the cold plaster of the wall, pulling my knees to my chest. I placed the phone on the floor beside me, the dispatcher's voice a tiny metallic whisper asking if I was still there. I didn't dare answer. The footsteps reached the second-floor landing. They moved down the hallway, stopping at the first guest room. The door was pushed open. Silence. Then they moved to the second guest room. The same process. Finally, the shadow of a pair of heavy work boots appeared under the gap of the master bedroom door. The air in the room felt entirely depleted of oxygen. I stared at the brass doorknob, illuminated only by the faint moonlight bleeding through the window. The brass mechanism began to rotate. It wasn't a violent shake or a frantic pull. It was a slow, incredibly deliberate test of the locking cylinder. The heavy oak door held firm against the frame. The turning stopped. The hand remained on the knob for a long, agonizing moment. In that suspended second of time, I knew that the person on the other side of the door was processing the fact that this specific room was locked from the inside. They knew someone was in there. I braced myself for the door to be splintered inward, calculating my complete lack of survival options in that enclosed space. But then, a new sound cut through the tension. From far down the county road, the faint, high-pitched wail of a police siren echoed through the winter air. The hand immediately released the doorknob. The heavy boots turned and moved rapidly down the hallway, descending the stairs with dangerous speed. I heard the back door slam violently against the frame, followed by the sound of someone sprinting into the deep snow of the tree line. By the time the sheriff's deputy finally pulled his cruiser up to the house, the property was completely silent again. The physical items that were stolen that night were eventually replaced by insurance. They were just objects, televisions, old tools, some forgotten jewelry. They held no real weight. But the psychological intrusion is permanent. It is the cold, lingering understanding of what happens when the barriers of isolation work against you instead of for you. It is the memory of that brass doorknob slowly turning in the dark, and the terrifying realization of how comfortable a predator can become when they believe no one is watching. There is a very specific, deeply ingrained, false sense of security that comes with living in a densely populated suburban neighborhood. When you share walls with neighbors, when there are always cars parked on the street, and when you can hear the faint hum of lawnmowers on a Tuesday afternoon, you naturally assume you are insulated from targeted violence. You convince yourself that isolation is the primary ingredient for danger. I spent the vast majority of my time working as a freelance data analyst from the ground floor unit of a standard, remarkably ordinary duplex. My daily routine was dictated almost entirely by the glow of my monitors, making my home my permanent workspace. The initial breach of my perimeter did not happen in the dead of night. It happened at 2 o'clock on a sunny Wednesday afternoon. I was at my desk in the front room when the doorbell chimed. It was broad daylight, and the postal worker was actively delivering mail just 2 houses down the street. Under these parameters, a knock at the door rarely registers as a threat. I walked to the entryway and opened the door, fully expecting a parcel delivery. Standing on my welcome mat was a clean-cut man in his late 30s. He was dressed in a completely unremarkable manner: khaki trousers, a dark blue polo shirt, and a lanyard holding a plastic identification card that was deliberately flipped backward. He offered a highly practiced, entirely hollow smile and immediately asked for me by my full, legally documented name. This was the first psychological red flag. In my daily life, I use a shortened version of my middle name. Only government entities, financial institutions, and legal documents utilize the full 3-name string he had just vocalized. I confirmed my identity with a degree of hesitation. He proceeded to explain that he was an independent insurance investigator, following up on a significant liability claim filed against my vehicle, and he requested permission to step inside my living room to review some critical paperwork. My vehicle was parked mere feet away in the driveway, completely undamaged. Furthermore, his body language was aggressive under the guise of politeness. He was repeatedly shifting his weight forward, attempting to casually position his heavy work boot just over the threshold of my doorway to prevent me from closing it. Social conditioning trains us to be accommodating, to avoid awkwardness, and to trust people who present themselves with an air of authority. Survival instinct, however, is a much older and far more reliable system. It was quietly screaming at me that this man was a predator probing my defenses. I ignored social convention, stated firmly that I had no idea what he was talking about, and physically forced the door shut, immediately engaging the heavy brass deadbolt. I spent the remainder of the afternoon fighting a quiet, persistent sense of paranoia. We are excellent at rationalizing our own fear, telling ourselves we overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. I convinced myself he was just an aggressive door-to-door scammer. By nightfall, I had almost entirely compartmentalized the incident. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth when the doorbell chimed again. The sound was profoundly jarring in the quiet house. Nobody visits unannounced at that hour, especially not in a quiet residential zone. The rationalization I had built up all afternoon instantly evaporated. I walked silently down the hallway, keeping the lights off, and approached the front door. I pressed my eye against the small glass peephole. It was the same man from the afternoon. However, the benign disguise of the polo shirt was gone. He was now wearing a heavy, dark windbreaker, a thick knit cap pulled low over his brow, and a blue surgical mask covering the lower half of his face. He was standing perfectly still under the amber glow of the porch light. The most terrifying detail was his right arm. It was buried deep inside the large front pocket of the windbreaker, and the heavy, rigid outline of the fabric clearly indicated he was gripping something substantial. This completely shattered the profile of a standard home invasion. Burglars actively seek out empty properties. They want a fast, quiet extraction of valuable goods. This man had specifically waited until the house was dark, until he knew I was inside and likely preparing for sleep. He had verified my identity during the day, and he had returned at night. I was not standing between him and my belongings. I was the objective. I backed away from the door with excruciating slowness, desperately trying to avoid casting a moving shadow that might be visible through the small gap beneath the doorframe. I retrieved my mobile phone from the kitchen counter and dialed the emergency services number, moving toward the center of the house to put as much structural mass between myself and the front door as possible. I spoke to the dispatcher in a tight, controlled whisper, explaining that the man who had harassed me earlier was now back on my porch, masked and likely armed. While the dispatcher was silently dispatching patrol units, the man outside grew impatient. He stopped waiting for me to answer the chime. Through the solid wood of the door, he spoke my full legal name again. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, simply stating that he knew I was standing in the hallway and demanding that I disengage the locks. When I refused to respond, he abandoned all attempts at subtlety. The physical assault on the house was instantaneous and devastating. There was no attempt to pry the door or pick the lock. He simply placed the muzzle of a firearm directly against the brass cylinder of the deadbolt and fired. The discharge of a high-caliber weapon within an enclosed residential hallway is not simply a loud noise. It is a violent, concussive wave of kinetic pressure that physically assaults the body. The structural integrity of the lock shattered completely, sending sharp fragments of brass and splintered wood tearing through the drywall behind me. The air was instantly choked with the bitter, metallic stench of vaporized gunpowder and burnt insulation. The immediate physiological trauma to my auditory system was paralyzing. My hearing was completely wiped out in a fraction of a second, entirely replaced by a shrill, deafening, high-pitched frequency that caused my vision to blur. The loss of a primary sense induces a level of panic that is impossible to articulate. I dropped to the floor, clutching my phone, completely unable to hear if the dispatcher was still speaking, or, far more critically, if the heavy door had swung open. I crawled blindly toward the rear corridor, expecting at any moment to feel the physical impact of a second projectile. But the secondary attack never came. I remained on the floor, disoriented and trapped in a localized silence, until the pulsing reflection of emergency strobe lights eventually flooded the living room windows. The police officers secured the property and found the front door hanging open, the locking mechanism completely hollowed out by the ballistic impact. On the concrete porch, they recovered a single shell casing. The leading theory from the investigating detectives was that the sheer volume of the gunshot, combined with the immediate realization that a firearm discharge in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac would trigger an overwhelming and instantaneous police response, had caused the assailant to panic and abort the entry. He fled the scene before stepping foot inside the house. To this day, the case remains entirely unsolved. The detectives conducted a thorough audit of my life. They examined my financial records, my professional communications, and my personal relationships. They found absolutely no motive. I have no gambling debts, no criminal associations, and no hostile former partners. I am a completely unremarkable citizen, and that is the darkest, most corrosive truth I was forced to extract from this ordeal. The psychological terror does not stem from the violence itself, but from the absolute lack of logic behind it. Somewhere in the world, an individual possesses my full legal name, knows the exact geographic coordinates of my residence, and harbors a violent intent toward me for a reason I do not comprehend. It destroys the comforting illusion that if you live quietly and follow the rules, you are safe from predators. It proves that sometimes you simply end up on a list, and the walls of your quiet suburban home are completely insufficient to keep the outside world from coming in.